The world, for a creature as small as Arya, was not a single entity but a tapestry of countless, shifting kingdoms. Her kingdom was the root tangle, a subterranean labyrinth of dark, moist corridors and vast, echoing chambers where the only light was the cool, blue phosphorescence of foxfire fungi clinging to the ancient timber. She was a Pika, a tiny lagomorph whose life was a symphony of frantic preparation and hushed vigilance, and her understanding of the forest was etched not in maps, but in the taste of the wind, the texture of bark, and the precise angle of the sun as it filtered through the canopy 100 feet above. The forest was the Greater Spire, a mountain range of wood and leaf that dominated the continent's northern shoulder. It was not one forest, but a layered, living geography. At its foundation lay the floor, a realm of perpetual twilight. Here, in the humus and decay, empires of fungi waged silent wars, their mycelial networks, the wood wide web, threading through the soil, trading nutrients and warnings between trees. Arya knew this realm only as a ceiling of crumbly earth and a source of strange, umbrella-shaped intruders after the rains. For a timber wolf named Kale, whose paws were the size of Arya's entire body, the floor was a highway. His geography was written in scents, the sharp, anxious musk of a deer herd a mile east, the fading perfume of a rival pack marking a boundary stone, the intoxicating sweetness of a berry thicket in the high meadows. His forest was a network of trails, each with a story and a purpose, his memory a living atlas of migrations and ambush sites. Above the floor rose the understory, a dense, thorny world of saplings, shrubs, and relentless competition. This was the domain of the goshawk, Soren, for whom geography was a matter of sight lines and launch pads. His map was a three-dimensional grid of perches and clearings. The old lightning-blasted snag was a perfect vantage to survey the fern glade where rabbits frolicked. The dense cluster of ironwood was an impenetrable barrier, the canopy of the young sugar maple a flimsy hiding place. He understood air currents, the thermal that rose from the sun-baked southern slope, the treacherous, swirling eddies in the valley, as a sailor knows the sea. The forest, to Soren, was not trees, but an arrangement of opportunities and obstacles in the fluid medium of air. Then there was the canopy, the forest's vibrant, sun-drenched roof. This was the realm of Alara, a southern flying squirrel. Her world was horizontal and vertical, but never the ground. The geography here was one of connection and terrifying gap. The great-grandfather white pine was her city, its thick, resin-scented branches her boulevards. The span between it and the neighboring hemlock was a gulf she crossed in a breathless, controlled plummet, her patagium stretched taut. She knew which branches were rotten, which were steadfast, which would bend under the weight of a late-season snow. Her forest was a constellation of trees, each a star, connected by the black lines of night. The vine of wild grape was her bridge, the abandoned woodpecker hole her fortress. Rain was a drumbeat on a million leaves, wind was a terrifying, exhilarating ride. And presiding over all, in a timescale so vast it was almost geological, were the elders, the ancient trees. A Douglas fir known as the Sentinel had stood for 8 centuries. Its geography was inward and expansive. Its roots drank from an aquifer deep in the mountain's bones, a secret sea it shared reluctantly with its kin through the fungal network. It felt the tremor of the rockfall on the far ridge, the slow, grinding retreat of the glacier that had carved their valley 10,000 years prior. Its rings were a library of climate. Years of thick growth during long, wet summers, the narrow, desperate bands of the Great Drought. It remembered the fire that swept through when it was a sapling, the scar still a rough badge on its northern flank. The forest, for the Sentinel, was not separate from the mountain, the sky, or the slow dance of continents. It was all one system. The story of this forest geography began not with life, but with stone. The Greater Spire was born from a titanic collision of tectonic plates, a crumpling of the Earth's crust that thrust limestone and granite skyward, forming peaks that snatched moisture from the passing clouds. Glaciers, rivers, and frost sculpted the rock into a topography of consequence. Sheer cliffs, sheltered coves, sun-facing slopes and cold, shadowed ravines. This was the first map, the underlying parchment. Soil built upon it, thin and poor on the ridges, deep and rich in the valleys. Water wrote its own patterns, the roaring main river in the gorge, the silent seep of a spring feeding a mossy bowl, the seasonal torrent of a snowmelt creek. Life followed these physical lines. On the dry, windy southern slopes, fire-adapted ponderosa pines stood in park-like spacings, their thick, puzzle-piece bark a testament to a fiery history. In the damp, Cool north-facing ravines, dense stands of hemlock and cedar thrived, the air thick with the smell of damp rot and vitality. The high meadows above the treeline, a world of relentless sun and wind, were a kingdom of stunted wildflowers, pikas like aria, and marmots. The river corridor was a different world altogether, a linear jungle of alder and willow, home to otters and dippers. Aria's life was a monument to microgeography. Her haypile, a carefully curated collection of grasses, flowers, and medicinal herbs, was stored in a specific chamber of the root tangle where the humidity was just right to prevent mold but not desiccation. She knew which sun-warmed rock on the talus slope would dry her harvest fastest. Her warning whistle echoed with perfect clarity off a particular rock face, amplifying the alarm to her colony. Her entire existence was a response to the brutal, simple geography of altitude. Summer was fleeting, winter interminable. Every sunbeam was a treasure, every moment not spent gathering was a potential deficit that could mean starvation in the long, white silence. Kale's pack, on the other hand, lived by a geography of ranges and routes. Their territory was a rough circle encompassing the headwaters of the Silverun River. Its boundaries were marked by scent posts and howling stations, the great hollow log at 3 Pines, the lightning-struck oak on Ridgeback. They knew that the elk moved to the high aspen groves in early autumn, and that the beaver pond in the western swamp was a reliable source of sluggish summer prey. Their trails avoided the steepest cliffs and the densest, paw-snagging thickets of the understory, following instead the subtle contours of the land, the hidden passes, the game highways worn by generations of hooves. One autumn, the geography of the Greater Spire began to change. It started subtly, not with a roar, but with a new scent on the wind. Kale caught it first, a harsh, acrid tang that coated the back of his throat. It was not of the forest. It came from the east, from beyond the ridge that marked the edge of his known world. Then came the sounds, a distant, rhythmic thunder that was not a rockslide, a high, whining shriek that was no bird or prey animal. The air, which usually carried the clean scents of pine, damp earth, and decay, now sometimes held a greasy, metallic smell. High in the canopy, Alara noticed the silence first. The dawn chorus seemed muted. The constant, background chatter of the red squirrels took on a frantic, scolding edge. Then, one morning, she saw it. From her perch in the sentinel, she looked east and saw a bare, brown scar on the green face of a distant mountain. It was as if a giant had scraped away the fur of the forest. Tendrils of dusty roads snaked from the scar into the still green woods at its edge. The world, which had always ended in a blue haze of more trees, now had a hard, jagged edge. Deep in the soil, the sentinel felt the change. The delicate, thirsty tips of its roots, always exploring for moisture and minerals, touched something toxic. A poison seeped into the mycelial network, a chemical bitterness that made the fungal threads recoil. Messages of distress, normally flowing freely between the trees, warnings of beetle infestations, requests for carbon, became garbled, then ceased in the eastern sectors. The forest's underground communication system was going dark. For Arya, the change was immediate and terrifying. The new, roaring sounds from the east echoed weirdly in her talus slope, masking the subtle noises of approaching predators. The air sometimes tasted wrong, making her nose twitch and her eyes water. Then came the day the ground shook. Not with the familiar, deep tremor of a far-off rockslide, but with a constant, grinding vibration. A few days later, a new, choking dust settled on her carefully drying hay, rendering it inedible. Her perfect, micro-managed world was being smothered. Kale's pack grew restless. The elk herds they relied upon were shifting, moving erratically, spooked by the noises and smells. The pack's carefully maintained scent marks on the eastern border were being overlaid by the stench of diesel and iron. Driven by hunger and unease, Kale led a small scout party over the ridge. What they saw from the tree line froze the blood in their veins. Where a dense stand of mixed fir and spruce had stood, there was now a grotesque, flattened landscape. The earth was churned to mud, studded with the stark, white wounds of tree stumps. Giant, yellow machines coughed smoke as they clanked and growled, their metallic jaws ripping at the few remaining living trees. The geography was not just altered, it was erased. The trails, the hiding places, the stream banks where deer drank, all were gone, replaced by a featureless, muddy plain. It was a vision of a world unmade. A low, heartfelt growl rose in Kale's throat, a sound of profound confusion and loss. This was not a fire, which cleansed and renewed. This was an ending. The change advanced like a tide. The logging operation, a geometric block of destruction, pushed westward. Animals were displaced, compressed into the shrinking intact forest. Competition for food and space became fierce, a pressure cooker of fear. Kale's pack found themselves in clashes with a rival pack from the north, both forced into overlapping territories. The delicate balance of predator and prey was upended. Alara, one night, made a desperate glide from her familiar pine towards a tall spruce she used as a secondary nest. But the geography had betrayed her. A swath of trees between her launch point and her target had been felled just that day. The gap, which had been a manageable 30 feet, was now a horrifying 80-foot chasm over a wasteland of splintered wood. She launched on instinct, but her patagium could only do so much. The glide turned into a plummet. She landed hard in a pile of branches, winded and terrified, in a world of raw stumps and unfamiliar, terrifying openness. The canopy, her entire universe, had been torn asunder. The poison in the soil reached the root tangle. Arya's colony began to sicken. The tender roots they nibbled on tasted metallic. The clean water that seeped through the rocks now carried a faint, chemical taint. One by one, the oldest and youngest pikas grew listless and died. Arya, driven by a deep, instinctual imperative, knew she had to move. But to where? Her kind lived only on talus slopes, specific geological formations that took millennia to create. The nearest one was miles away, across forest she was not built to traverse, full of predators from whom she had no hiding place. The crisis culminated in a storm. A great autumn gale, laden with moisture from the distant ocean, swept into the mountains. For centuries, the forest geography had managed such storms. The canopy broke the wind's force. The deep, sponge-like soil of the floor, held together by a web of roots and fungi, absorbed the torrential rain, releasing it slowly into streams and aquifers. But now, on the eastern flank, the land was naked. The rain fell on bare, compacted earth. With no roots to hold it, no leaf litter to cushion it, the soil turned to slurry. The water did not sink in, it ran off. It gathered in rivulets, then streams, then a raging, brown torrent that swept down the denuded slopes. It carried with it the topsoil of millennia, the very flesh of the mountain. It smashed into the still forested valley below with the force of a landslide. In the root tangle, Arya heard a new sound, a deep, grinding roar that grew louder, drowning out even the rain. It was not above her. It was all around her. The earth itself seemed to be moving. A wall of mud, rocks, and shattered trees, unleashed from the clear-cut slope above, hit the talus field. The carefully balanced rocks that were her home were ripped from their places and tumbled like dice in a giant's hand. Arya's world was literally crumbling. She fled, a tiny gray blur scrambling over shifting stones, driven by pure terror, just ahead of the crushing, liquid earth. Kale and his pack, hunting in a lower valley, were caught by the flash flood that followed the slide. The familiar, gentle Silverun River transformed in minutes into a monstrous, boiling brown beast, overflowing its banks, tearing ancient trees from its edges. The wolves fled to high ground, howling in alarm, their geographical knowledge rendered useless by this new, rampaging watercourse. The sentinel stood on the edge of the chaos. The mudslide tore at its roots on the uphill side, exposing great, pale limbs that had not seen light in 8 centuries. The torrent of water and debris washed away the younger trees at its feet. It sensed the immense weight of water straining its root hold, the sudden, shocking absence of kin it had communicated with for centuries. A great groan, the sound of wood under ultimate stress, emanated from its core. It was not a sound of pain, but of profound geological shifting, a mountain adjusting to a new, painful reality. In the aftermath, the geography of the Greater Spire was forever altered. The eastern valley was a scene of apocalyptic change. A raw, muddy scar marked the path of the slide. The river, choked with silt, ran sluggish and brown, its course littered with dead trees and debris. The clear cut, now revealed as a catastrophic error, was a bleeding wound on the mountainside. But the story of a forest's geography is not just one of destruction, it is also one of resilience and recalibration. Life, driven by ancient imperatives, began immediately to redraw the map. In the mud of the slide path, willow shoots, pioneers evolved for catastrophe, were the first to appear, their roots binding the raw earth. Fireweed, its seeds carried on the wind from distant, healthy meadows, painted the gray mud with splashes of purple. These were the cartographers of the New Age, drawing the first, tentative lines on the blank parchment. Arya did not survive the slide. But a young cousin from a neighboring colony, whose own slope was less affected, would eventually, in a few years, explore the new, stabilized talus that formed at the base of the slide. It was different, the rocks were sharper, the spaces larger, but it was home. The geography had changed, but the need for a Pika's kingdom remained. Kale's pack, diminished and wiser, abandoned the eastern part of their territory. They redrew their mental maps, shrinking their circle to encompass only the most stable, intact forest to the west and north. Their howls now held a new note, a warning about the silent, two-legged danger that could unmake worlds. Alara, battered but alive, found a new grove of trees a mile to the south. The gaps were wider, the risks greater, but she learned. Her offspring would grow up knowing a forest with edges, with open spaces that demanded longer glides and held new dangers like hawks with fewer trees to hide in. The canopy was no longer infinite, but it was still a kingdom. And the sentinel, though wounded, held its ground. Its exposed roots, over decades, would be reclothed in moss and soil. New seedlings, hemlock, fir, maple, would take root in the nutrient-rich mud at its feet, nurtured by the shade and stability it still provided. It would become the elder of a new forest, its rings recording not just climate but catastrophe and recovery. The mycelial network, though damaged, would slowly regrow, stitching the wounded land back together, thread by microscopic thread. The forest's geography was a living, breathing, and fragile thing. It was a memory in the mind of a wolf, a glide path in the mind of a squirrel, a sun-warmed rock in the mind of a pika, and a deep, slow pulse in the heartwood of an ancient tree. It could be wounded, simplified, brutalized. But as long as the stone bones of the mountain stood, and the sun shone, and the rain fell, the green map would always try to redraw itself, telling its ancient, relentless story in bark and leaf, in trail and territory, in the endless, interconnected dance of life upon the land. The clear cut would eventually fade under a blanket of new growth, the scar of the slide would soften with alder and birch. The river would clear, finding a new course. The forest would not be the same, the specific arrangement of kingdoms lost forever, but it would be a forest again, a new geography born from the bones of the old, a testament to the enduring, evolving story of place.